Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. For this week, we are continuing our coverage of the global protests that have emerged in recent months against neoliberalism or neoliberal capitalism, however you want to formulate that. This week, we are talking first about Haiti and the protests that have been going on in Haiti. And so to talk about all of this, we are joined by Kim Ives, who is the editor of the English section of Haiti Liberte. Thank you very much, Kim, for coming on the show.
Glad to be here, Brianna.
Let's start with exactly what sparked these protests, because the protests in Haiti have been going on a very long time, and the sort of revelations of corruption of the Haitian government that first sparked this actually took place a couple years ago. Obviously, this is tied to kind of larger struggles within Haiti that predate that. But yeah, what initially sparked the protests that have been going on in Haiti the past year or so?
Well, the past year is really, I could say, the culmination of the past 33 to 34 years of struggle against the dictatorship of what is called the Makuto bourgeoisie of Haiti. This was the ruling group, the ruling class, composed of big landowners who are the Makuto part. The Makuts were the repressive arm of the Grandons, or the big landowners. And then the bourgeoisie of Haiti, which is basically an import-export bourgeoisie. They don't have any real factories. But this Makuto bourgeoisie was the power behind Jean-Claude Duvalier in 1986. And he was basically driven out by the people, by an uprising then. And it looked like they were maybe going to wrest power from this group through the election of Jean-Bertrand Aristide in 1990, 5 years after Jean-Claude fled the country. And it's been a struggle between the people, the masses of Haiti, that is the workers and peasants and the unemployed, against this ruling class really ever since. And the empire struck back, we could say, after the earthquake in 2010 by, instead of having the election of Jean-Bertrand Aristide twice, or René Préval, who was kind of a pale photocopy of him, twice. So for about 20 years, they were running the show, trying to, despite coups and occupations and all sorts of sabotage. But the U.S. connived with France and Canada, these are the three principal imperial powers in Haiti, to carry out an electoral coup d'etat. And they put into power this party called the Haitian Bald-Headed Party, or PHTK, represented by a fellow called Michel Martelly, who was a very ribald, vulgar compas singer. Compas is the popular music of Haiti. And he put in a regime that was just the devaluerist regime on steroids. The level of corruption and dysfunction was huge. And the pot that they were scooping it out of was, in fact, this Petrocaribe fund, which Venezuela had provided Haiti under President René Préval in 2008. And they scooped out about 75% of this fund. The way it worked was Venezuela would give Haiti all of its petroleum needs. That's about 20,000 barrels a day. Haiti would pay for 60% of that, but 40% would go into this fund, which was supposed to be used to build schools and hospitals, clinics, projects that would help the Haitian people. Basically, Hugo Chavez was trying to give Haiti and other countries, there were 17 countries with different Petro-Caribe deals, was trying to give them the capital to build their countries so they wouldn't have to turn to the IMF and USAID and the World Bank and all these vulture funds. And it could have been spectacular, except that the U.S. did this sort of low blow by bringing in Martelly. And now Martelly brought in his protege, who was a fellow called Jovenel Moïse. So what happened is this thing has really crystallized around Jovenel because, unfortunately for him, he came into power just when Trump did. And the first thing Trump did when he came into power in 2017 was to slap sanctions on Venezuela, which made it impossible for Haiti to pay for the gas that it was getting, for the oil it was getting. So essentially, and of course, Venezuela was under great duress as well. So essentially, Trump sunk the Petro-Caribe deal, and suddenly prices for gas were not the cheap gas that Venezuela was providing. And the IMF came in and read Jovenel Moïse, the Riot Act, and said, hey, buddy, you got to raise the gas price because you got to bring in some money so you can pay us for the loan we're going to give you. Well, he tried to do that last July 6th, 7th, and 8th. On July 6th, right after a match between Brazil and Belgium, World Cup match, which Brazil lost, angering many Haitians, but they came out of the game and found, all the gas prices were hiked, sometimes as high as 50%, and that set the country on fire. They were already disgusted, outraged, angry about the tremendous corruption, but now this gas price hike. So they shut down the country for 3 days, and that basically ever since then, ever since July 2018, the country has really not seen more than 2 months or 3 months of peace without major demonstrations, major lockdowns, what they call Haiti lock. The country is locked up. And so we're in the, I could say, final stages of this. And just to finish, the really interesting thing about this moment is Jovenel has clung to power so tenaciously, to some extent due, I think, to the fact that the Trump regime is not really minding the store. If this were a globalist government of Clinton or Obama, sort of replacement, but they just keep hanging on to Jovenel because he's voting with the U.S. presently against Venezuela. And as a result, the people have been radicalized to the point where they want a complete system change. So we're looking at maybe Haiti's second great social revolution, the first one having been in 1804, when slaves, for the first and last time in history, threw off the colonial yoke of France and slavery and founded the first, we could say, truly free country in the Western Hemisphere. But we're looking now at a second great social revolution in Haiti.
Yeah, there are so many threads I'd love to follow on this. The first, since you mentioned the 1804, the truth is that in many ways, since 1804, no kind of settler colonial country has ever forgiven Haiti for essentially declaring its independence, for being a true liberated country. It's insulting to me that like the U.S. Revolution, because it happened, the so-called American Revolution, Gerald Horne, the author of many books, actually considers it to be a counter-revolution. But anyway, the U.S. Revolution, the American Revolution, is considered to be like an inspiration for Haiti, or like at least that's the way our history kind of tells it. When in fact, the America, in many ways, threw off its kind of a colonial center, the imperial center there, which was Britain, and simply became a settled colonial power within its own right. Whereas Haiti actually deconstructed during that revolution that settled colonial mentality in a way that is truly unique. And so naturally, the countries of Europe have never forgiven Haiti. The United States has never forgiven Haiti. At one point, the U.S. Marines actually simply marched into Haiti and stole all of Haiti's gold. Haiti's been forced to pay reparations to France and to other countries. And so, that punishment of Haiti for trying to actually liberate itself from settled colonialism, I think, continues to this day. Another thing that I think is interesting about the Haitian situation in particular is because it was caused the situation today, that is to say the protests around gas prices, was caused by the U.S. trying to maintain or trying to essentially install a puppet regime in another country. That is to say, the U.S. Wanted to return Venezuela to the pre-Chavista and pre-Caracazo Venezuela of it being a U.S. puppet state. It wanted to essentially return Venezuela to the state that Haiti is in today. But in doing so, because Venezuela had such an internationalist outlook, because Venezuela had been supplying this oil to Haiti and to other countries through the Petrocaribe, the U.S. actually sparked what appears to be kind of a burgeoning revolution within one of its other puppet states. So this idea that the U.S. can continue to play whack-a-mole with these countries and sort of shoot down these people's revolutions, shoot down these kind of like revolts against neoliberalism, against the capitalist kind of world order, the U.S.-dominated world order as it is, it does appear to be falling apart in a great number of ways. And I guess one last point I'd like to kind of make before turning it over is this question of installing a Martelly in 2010. That was one of the several major regime change operations of the Obama administration. Hillary Clinton actually is Secretary of State when she, or later on when she kind of wrote her memoirs, when she wrote a book about it, actually bragged about that overthrow, as well as bragging about the overthrows of Gaddafi when she, laughed on live TV, said, we saw he died as a head of state was bayoneted in the street, and would also go on to brag about the overthrow of the Zelaya government and the installation there of an incredibly corrupt fascist right-wing regime. That's a legacy, I think, of the Obama administration. But yeah, under the Trump administration, it does appear, it's not necessarily related to these administrations. It's kind of the natural economic laws, I think, of capitalism. But it does seem that a lot of these kind of the ability for the U.S. to continually do this, and just the economic relations that propped this up do seem to be, I think, breaking down in some way. Basically, what is it looking like the outcome might be here?
Well, just picking up on your thread, yeah, I think pulling back a little bit, the U.S. government as the principal capitalist government on the planet is in some kind of dysfunction right now. We have a president who is at war with the institutions of this globalist elite, which has basically run the show since the Second World War, we can say. He's fighting with the State Department. He's fighting with the intelligence community, quote unquote. He's fighting with now the Pentagon even. And so they are really sort of flat on their feet. And in a way, historically, when imperialists are fighting among each other, as we saw, for instance, in the Second World War, it often opens a window where nationalists or even socialists can begin to emerge. We saw it after the Second World War with the emergence of, say, Vargas in Brazil, or Arbenz in Guatemala, or other Perón in Argentina, others. And the result is that the empire then has to play catch up, and they did the whack-a-mole thing on a lot of those governments, as you suggested, but they're increasingly unable to do so because, as Che said, they 1, 2, 3, many Vietnams. And so I think we're at that stage where the fires are spreading and growing and igniting faster than they can put them out. Okay, occasionally they get in a punch like we just saw in Bolivia. But in Haiti, for example, um, we have what I can really say is almost a spontaneous uprising. It doesn't even have a vanguard party at the head of it. It's just the people are fed up, and it's part of, I could say, the Haitian DNA. Every Haitian walks in glory for what their ancestors did, and they're raised with the stories of Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Henri Christophe, Alexandre Pétion, and the revolutionary role they played. So I think this revolution right now is it's resting at the current moment. This is generally over the past 4-5 decades of turmoil. What happens in the month of December is things sort of die down. There's supposed to be another big demonstration on the 5th of December. We'll see if that comes off, but we may see the people catching a breath after basically 2 months, 2.5 months of almost solid demonstrations of Haiti locked, of people just bringing the country to a halt. Nothing was functioning. And even the bourgeoisie is clamoring for a change because they're losing money like crazy as well. So we have a very tenuous situation for Moïse. I think we'll continue to see this sort of constant stream of U.S. administration officials. Last week, we saw Kelly Craft, the UN representative of the U.S., go down. Another State Department person went down this past week. But it's going nowhere. They can see they're hitting a wall. And right now, they're developing really they always have a plan A and a plan B. And so they're building this sort of opposition, which is going to probably try to put in place a government of national salvation. And what they mean is salvation of the capitalist system in Haiti. And this is made up of a lot of people who, in fact, were Moïse's close allies until very recently when they saw his ship was beginning to sink. So that's the situation. We're in this kind of limbo. They're officially still trying to prop up Moïse, calling for dialogue in sharp juxtaposition, of course, to what they do in Bolivia or Venezuela, or Nicaragua or Syria. But in Haiti, they're saying, oh, sit down, let's talk it out. It's not a big problem. But at the same time, they're preparing this alternative government, what's called the passerelle. We know this, we don't approve, but we see the characters who are at the head of it, who are a lot of the heads of the bourgeoisie, even though they put a couple of unions and human rights groups in front as window dressing. But in addition, certain people who are agents of the U.S. Historically, like a fellow called Edouard Pault, who's the Episcopal Bishop of Haiti. When you see him, you know Washington's finger is in the pie somewhere. So he's at the head of this passerelle opposition coalition, which has sort of met and marshaled the 5 different opposition fronts together into one front. And I think pretty soon they'll make a bid for power somehow. Maybe it'll be a phone call from Trump's office, or maybe it will be some security guard taking a pot shot at him. But sooner or later, I think Jovenel is going to be trying to get out of the country.
If you're just tuning in, you are listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 Austin, and we also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 New Orleans. We are also available as a podcast wherever podcasts are podded. We are speaking with Kim Ives, the editor of the English section of Haiti Liberte, about the protests in Haiti and the kind of prospects for a kind of change of power within that country, and how it generally relates to the global protests against neoliberalism at the moment. I think you raise an interesting point with the fact that the U.S. always has a plan A and a plan B. The plan A is almost always to keep the dictator in power, or the person executing the dictatorial system. Something that people need to understand is that there doesn't need to be a single kind of person running a dictatorship in order for it to be a kind of dictatorship of a specific class of people. Venezuela, for instance, pre-Chavista and generally up into the Caracazo, essentially had kind of two major political parties that would switch off every few years, but essentially regardless of the political party, regardless of the president in power, the Venezuelans would continue to get poorer. The mineral wealth will continue to be exported to the U.S., to U.S. corporations. And so every year, more and more people found themselves impoverished under this, what the U.S. called a quote-unquote model democracy for Latin America. That was kind of their model, and just to understand that, like, it doesn't have to be kind of a dictatorship. And so that's usually the plan B. Like, the plan A is to just keep whoever it is who's the quote unquote strongman or whatnot in power. But as we've seen, for instance, over and over again, I think, for instance, with the fall of the Shah, the U.S. plan A was to keep the Iranian Shah in power in 1953. Or 1979, rather. The U.S. original plan was to keep the Shah in power. When the Shah was going to fall, the U.S. backup plan was to essentially install, rather than a socialist government, which was coming to power, which had the kind of opportunity to seize power, the U.S. instead made sure that essentially the government went to the Ayatollahs, went to an Islamic regime that they believed that they could control more. The same thing with the end of the Pinochet dictatorship. Even though Pinochet left, the dictatorial powers, the constitution was still the same. The Pinochet constitution was still there. So Chile remained a kind of dictatorship of capital. And I think you can apply that to a lot of different examples.
In Haiti, they called it devaluerism without Duvalier in the years from 1986 to 1990. But the people were just so relentless in their mobilization, despite massacres, despite all sorts of feints. Essentially, the U.S. government had in mind putting in a World Bank economist, a guy called Marc Bazin, as the president. They thought it would be a piece of cake. They didn't even think it would cost that much money to do, because Haiti, things are cheap. Buying a crowd, renting a mob, no problem. But it didn't work out the way they'd planned, and that's why Haiti was the first nation in Latin America to really foil U.S. election engineering in 1990 by electing this anti-imperialist liberation theologian priest, Jean-Bertrand Aristide. It was a huge malfunction which caught the eye of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and Evo Morales in Bolivia and others who a few years later did the same thing, put together an electoral coalition and took power through these demonstration elections they tried to put their puppets in across the hemisphere. So we're at a stage now where it's like the Borg in Star Trek, they keep sort of morphing each time you find a way to combat it. But I think we're getting to the point where the people have learned most of the tricks and they're not going to be fooled again.
Yeah. So what, I guess, then are the tricks that they really have kind of learned? Like what essentially has the evolution of kind of tactics, ideological outlook, coalitions, whatever the case is. Basically, like how would you say that kind of the people of Haiti have responded to these kind of U.S. tricks?
Well, I think primarily we can say a lot of the politicians that the U.S. has either bought off or bullied have begun to lose their credibility. At one point, they come out as the great champion, and you think, well, they're really going to be able to turn things around, and then the people sort of see through them. This has been the case with a number of the coalitions we've seen in Haiti, and we're waiting to see what will happen, particularly with the Lavalasse family party of Aristide, which has traditionally been the great hope of the Haitian people. and a split off, a group called Petit Dessalines, Dessalines' children, headed by a very charismatic senator named Moïse Jean-Charles. Now, Aristide is really an apostle of Toussaint Louverture. And Toussaint Louverture, who led the struggle of Saint-Domingue's slaves to throw off slavery, was nonetheless not in favor of Haitian independence per se. Essentially, what he said to the French Assembly and Napoleon was that, let me run the island instead of your governors. I can do a better job. But it was the age of colonialism, not neocolonialism. Napoleon would have none of it. And they ended up kidnapping Toussaint, the same way they kidnapped Aristide twice, and sent him to prison in France, where he died. And the people said, well, if that's what it's going to be, we need full independence. And hence Haiti became the first independent nation of Latin America and a model and a touchstone, really, for the revolutions across the continent. Because, of course, it was Haiti that gave Bolivar his guns and boats and printing presses and soldiers even to fight the wars of liberation on the continent. And to this day, you'll see the Haitian flag and all the flags of the northern South American countries, the red and blue with a yellow top. But to some extent, Aristide has the same approach. He keeps thinking that somehow his great appeal and authority with the people will allow Washington or convince Washington to use him instead of these other corrupt politicians. And I think the Haitian people at one point sort of believed in that, but they don't anymore. They say no. And that's where the split off came. Dessalines, who was the leader who brought Haitian independence, said, no, we have to totally cut ties with the empire, with the French. We have to cut ties with Europe. And the result was Haiti. Petit Dessalines had very much this same idea and notion. Haiti Liberte was sort of involved in that Dessalinian emergence, but that leader too has sort of stopped short of really carrying out a Dessalinian program by his wheeling and dealing and alliances with members of the bourgeoisie who inevitably betray him. So the people have watched this, they've been learning, and so they're really becoming quite skeptical and discerning, and I would say educated on how to carry out a revolution. And that's why I think this situation is so pregnant with a new society.
We were joined by Kim Ives, who's the editor of the English section of Haiti Liberte. Thank you very much, Kim, for coming on the show.
Well, thank you, Brianna, and I hope we can talk again.
Absolutely. You're listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. Stay tuned. Now we turn to another kind of global struggle against neoliberalism that's happening in Lebanon. We just heard from Kim Ives, the editor of Haiti Liberte, about the conditions in Haiti. And now we are turning to what are broadly called anti-corruption, but in many ways are also anti-neoliberal protests that have happened in the past several months in Lebanon that have led to the ouster of much of the government there. So to talk about kind of the current state of affairs, the history of Lebanon leading up to this particular point, and so much more, we are now joined by Jana Nakhal, who is an urban planner, independent researcher, and a member of the Central Committee of the Lebanese Communist Party. Thank you very much, Jana, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start, of course, with the kind of economic conditions that led up to this. The Lebanese state has been forced to kind of make many concessions to neoliberalism in recent years through kind of different kinds of debt traps, different kinds of IMF loans, and other sort of essentially economic imperialism like that. So how is that sort of taken shape in Lebanon in particular, and what sort of was the response of people to that?
And different governments following more and more neoliberal policies, which are proposing, each government after the other, proposing to pay our debts by taking more and more debts. So we live in a country where we're indebted to the extent that in 1997, around 40% of the budget is used to pay the service of our public debt. Meaning the 60% of this country, of what this country produces, is generally used for expenses of everything else, services, health coverage, projects, the salaries of employees, etc. While 40% of the production of the whole population of this country is just paid to serve the public debt. Meaning at the same time that this is the debt we're paying for our millionaires, for the political leaders who are non-stop being held accountant now, but who have been over and over again after each and every election held their position, whether in the parliament or in different levels of the government. So we're at the stage now where we are at a stage now that we're calling the collapse in Arabic, or al-inhiyar, which is we're waiting for the lira, for the Lebanese currency to collapse, for actually the state to call or to announce its bankruptcy, because this is where the neoliberalism led us to. At the same time, we talk about years and years of educating people into hating one another, educating the different sects, the different communities, and the different individuals to search for the enemy, to search for the cause of the economic and social problems in the other, meaning the other sect, the other religion, the other region, etc. This is a very important because very few moments at which a generic position vis-a-vis the othering has started to actually shift. People are stopping and they're halting this attack on the others and on the other communities. They're stopping attacks on different sects, and they're saying that the actual enemy, those who are stealing over and over again, are the ruling bourgeoisie. Whether they call it the ruling bourgeoisie, whether they're calling the rich, whether they call it just the authorities, this is practically what is happening right now.
From the kind of U.S. war on terror, we get this idea that sectarianism is just kind of a part of Arab societies in various ways, when in fact this kind of sectarianism and this the highly sectarian Lebanese government was actually something that was imposed from the French colonial system. Can you talk about how that kind of affects the just general, like how the government kind of functions in that way?
I would start answering this question by going back to one of the very famous Lebanese Marxist thinkers, who's Mahdi Amel. He tries to explain the Lebanese state or the Lebanese the situation in Lebanon by saying that it is totally the Lebanese bourgeoisie's let's say creation, which is saying that the problem in Lebanon is sectarian. So what he tries to say is that the problem in Lebanon, as anywhere else in the world, is class. And it is the Lebanese bourgeoisie which has tried over and over again to show that class struggle is not really class struggle, but it's a form of sectarian struggle. So it is hiding class struggle by sectarian struggle, by deforming and transforming what class struggle is. And so over and over again, we have been listening to politicians, to political leaders, to Zaim, the local name of political leaders. Of each and every sect sect calling or attacking the other sect because he is trying to tell each and every community that your enemy is the other sect, your enemy is those who belong to the other religion. Simply put, you as whatever, you are as a Christian, you as a Sunni, you as a Shia are poor because the other Sunni or Shia or a Christian is rich. So this has been happening over and over again instead of us understanding that us as working class are poor because the bourgeoisie from all sects are rich. So what is happening right now is this kind of a period or moment of awareness that Lenin has talked over and over about, where people have started talking about them being the rich of all the sects working together, and us being the poor no matter what sect and what region we're coming from.
There's been a lot of attempt by the U.S. to steer this in a direction where the U.S. is essentially concerned mostly with getting rid of Hezbollah. Everything with regard to the U.S. Foreign policy in this always has something to do with Hezbollah and always has something to do with quote unquote stopping Iranian influence. Everything with regard to the U.S., at least the way the kind of corporate media here talks about it, everything is somehow related in Lebanon, is somehow related to Hezbollah and to Iran. And so it seems like the U.S. is trying to use this as an attempt. Essentially, of course, their plan A was to keep Hariri in power, to keep the sort of Lebanese client state in power. But since that appears to be very much folding, since the protests were strong enough, the U.S. seems to be trying to use this to essentially keep the same power relations in place under essentially a different name, and to use this as an excuse to get Hezbollah out and essentially have what I think Jana Nakhal has described as a technocratic state. I'm wondering what you kind of think of that kind of formulation. What kind of role has Hezbollah played? What generally are the class character of the struggles of the protests beyond simply that kind of formulation of everything having to do with Hezbollah somehow and everything coming back to that? Like what is kind of the real situation?
Thank you for talking about this, because I'm sorry to tell some like the majority of Western journalists that not everything in Lebanon is about Hezbollah. And unfortunately also for them, the Lebanese politics are so complex and complicated that until now, I don't think I've found any of the Western journalists able to fully understand and then fully portray the Lebanese, let's say, politics. I'm sorry also to break this up to you. Hezbollah is not against Hariri. For the past, let's say, year or so, since Hariri came back from KSA after being kidnapped by MBS Mohammed bin Salman, Hezbollah was the main, let's say, party which defended him and brought him back. And supported him coming back, and supported his power, and let's say reinforced his leadership, because Hariri is currently suffering from strong blows, both at the economic level as well as political level. Hariri's family, but specifically Saad al-Hariri himself, his companies has been suffering from very strong economic blows. He actually closed down several of his companies, including the TV and all of the media outlets that his father had created, and which actually formed and forged and developed all of the neoliberal discourse in Lebanon. This is one. Two, Hariri's political representation, and let's say what is called the Sunni street, which is the sect he represents, has become more and more weak, because he has been unable to pay the services of the people of his sect, because that's how political leaders connect communities to themselves. So he was unable to pay for neither employees nor for health insurance, like health coverage, nor for education of many of the members of his sect. So his leadership in itself has been very much weakened. He has only been able to stay in power because of the support of Hezbollah, because Hezbollah read his kidnapping by MBS by thinking that Hariri has been weakened. Hariri is now not supported by the KSA. So this is a brilliant moment for us to have a political leader from the Sunni street, which is backed by us, and which as a result we can actually control. So just to explain why the first as much as the third or the second speech of Nasrallah after the start of the Intifada itself was pretty much saying, do whatever you want. Demonstrate as much as you want. This is all a loss of time. I'm sorry for this. Hariri is going to stay in power. I'm saying verbatim what Nasrallah was saying. So it is very much quite a complex thing for Westerners, Western media, Western journalists to understand, specifically if they do not speak Arabic or read Arabic. I'm sorry if they cannot translate or understand Nasrallah's speeches. So knowing that this was the case, Hariri's resignation in itself was the first let's say, defeat of both Hariri and Hezbollah in the government. Because for us, as you know, I'm talking about the internal situation. I'm talking about the internal position, and Hezbollah within the Lebanese politics is a very much neoliberal party. It has supported the neoliberal policies of Hariri Sr., of the father of Hariri Jr., since the 90s. So in no sense can Hezbollah say that internally it is revolutionary, or that internally it is anti-US, or that internally it is anti-imperialism. So this is why what we are talking about when we talk about this intifada, we talk about a change in the whole system in Lebanon, including Hezbollah, including Hariri, including all the right wing, because unfortunately, when you look at it from outside and you say, oh my God, this intifada can allow the West to intervene, I'm sorry to tell you once more that the West has already been intervening within the parliament, within the government, which is of course supported by Hezbollah. Several of the right wings, which Hezbollah has been over and over again working with, specifically by destroying the unions in Lebanon. And I'm talking about Lebanese parties as the Lebanese Forces or the Phalanges, which are known as the Kata'ib. These are totally and fully known to be supported and by the US, and they openly talk about their right-wing policies. So when we talk about the internal policies, the internal politics and what Hezbollah's positions are in Lebanon, it is a totally different thing from when we talk about Hezbollah facing Israel or the US in the region.
So essentially, while Hezbollah has played a kind of a historic role in sort of defense against Israeli aggression, generally it still is part of that kind of neoliberal status quo. The Lebanese protests, from my understanding, have really called for essentially everybody to go out for an entire shift in the government, and that really... Exactly. It's that same thing where you have essentially two parties pretending to be in sort of grave opposition to each other when essentially they still have that same class. I mean, they're essentially aligned on class and on kind of 90% of the issues.
Exactly. I just want to say one remark before we finish with this. It's pretty much a humiliation for the whole Lebanese peoples and everyone who's living in Lebanon to say that if we lose Hezbollah from the government, or if we lose Hezbollah from the parliament, or if we lose Hezbollah's representation anywhere in the Lebanese system, it means that the West has won. Because this is a country where the people have fought Israel even before Hezbollah has ever existed. And even if when we go down to the streets right now, it's an ongoing refusal of any kind of external intervention, whether by the US or anybody else. So it is very important for us to know that when we talk about revolutionary anti-US, anti-Israeli, anti-imperialist policies, we don't think about only political parties, but we think about the peoples of the country and the people of the region by itself.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We are talking with Jana Nakhal, an urban planner, independent researcher, and member of the Central Committee of the Lebanese Communist Party. So I'd like to turn us now kind of to the nature of the protest, sort of how it is they began and how it is they've sort of evolved to kind of the changing tactics of the kind of Lebanese state, as a Lebanese state has not only engaged in repression but also has attempted to engage in kind of false concessions that seem like a reform, but in fact are just kind of a further part of the same neoliberalism. What essentially, like, kind of how have these protests evolved in their class character, in their demands, in response to kind of how the government itself has responded?
Right. So the reason why we're not calling them protests or just demonstrations or hirak, which is movement, like we were calling them before, or simply, just a political action or activity, and we're calling them either revolution or intifada, is specifically because this is a moment where the class struggle has been pushed forward and has been pushed into, everybody's just speaking about it and speaking against privatization, etc. So the protests currently are carrying demands and cries of despair, specifically because of the economic situation. We're talking about, for once, this is a country in which blaming, as we said before, members of other sects and religions have turned into a working class and disenfranchised communities, obviously blaming the oligarchy. So this is why we think that this is a huge revolution at the level of awareness. At a second level, which is organization, which is underground, what's going on, we're talking about a morphing and changing of the demonstrations and of actions in the streets, depending on the moments, depending on the groups moving, depending on the regions, etc. So in some regions, people are just calling for, something that was used in Europe by the right wing, and Asad Abu Khalil is making fun of us because he does not understand the context of this. So in Europe, the right wing had been using banging on the how can we call it, like on the kitchen utensils at night. So people are using this soundscape to call for a revolution. While in Lebanon, we are using it because some communities cannot actually go down to the streets. Some people we're talking about older generation who cannot go and walk in the demonstration. We're talking about community or individuals who are oppressed by their own communities and cannot go into the streets because someone will attack them, or their own communities are going to see them in the streets and are going to threaten them and attack them because they're raising their voices against them. So the only way for them is to actually gather every night in their own houses, everyone in their houses, bang on the different utensils that can exist in each and every kitchen at 8 at night, kind of trying to create a soundscape around the whole city to show their joining and their support of the intifada. The different formations also in the different regions. We're talking about an intifada, which is very different in each and every region, as much as each and every region is different in its social structure and political structure. And it's very interesting for us to see that it's impossible for anyone to understand what's going on in this intifada if you only talk and see what is going on in Beirut, because also you're going back to the center. But what is happening right now is the different cities, the different towns, moving in their own and organizing in their own ways. I'm talking about university students demonstrating every other day in their schools. I'm talking about school students which have never moved since the 90s, and they're leaving their schools and they're demonstrating. We're talking about the formation of new unions. Since the beginning of the 90s, Hariri Sr. had destroyed the unions, and this has been the perfect moment for us to work on the formation of these political and radical unions. We're talking about organizing forms of communes. We're talking about people starting to organize around agriculture, because what we are expecting after the collapse and the destruction of the lira is a monopoly over specifically the main and basic food products. And this is why people have already, and also including the Lebanese Communist Party, have been organizing around food and food production and agriculture and lands. So this is this is how big it is, and this is how diverse it is. The intifada that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a very kind of fascinating and a very inspiring categorization for sure. I think it goes also to kind of the basic, kind of political theory of how to bring about a revolution. And that involves within any society sort of bringing together not just sort of the proletariat, the kind of urban working class, but also those the peasantry, the people in the rural areas, and trying to kind of forge these coalitions for these common causes, for the common good. It sounds like that's kind of what you're preparing for there, is not just sort of a revolution of kind of the urban center, but also really in many ways expanding everyone's ideas of kind of what is possible, of kind of a union building, of kind of a nationalization and a socialization of kind of the goods and services in a very kind of Marxist-Leninist framework. Is that correct? Is that kind of the way you're seeing it?
Definitely. Exactly. I'm talking about specifically, as I was telling you, why we're calling it an intifada. One of the reasons why we're calling it an intifada is because it is going into places and regions and towns and cities and villages which had never moved before. I mean, these people have been threatened and attacked and beaten in the streets for the past 46, I think, or 48 days. I can't remember. They have been facing what we in the cities haven't been facing. I mean, I've been going around Lebanon, and I've been going around these regions where I have also been attacked by these thugs. And have been talking about when he explained what the lumpen proletariat is, because we have been attacked by the poorest of the poor, who have been paid that we are against them, and that they have to beat us so that they can live. The political leaders in Lebanon are not only using the thugs, but they're also using the violence to actually impose their own press.
Yeah, so sorry about that to those who were listening. Obviously, one of the major things that has led to what can be characterized as this intifada, or the revolution kind of in progress in Lebanon, is the lack of kind of basic services. The internet is not only spotty there, but it's increasingly, people in the U.S. are also kind of seeing, problems with just basic connections. I know we've had problems at the station with that. But I'd like to go ahead and wrap it up in our last couple minutes. So I think most of the people who listen to my show, I assume almost all of them, already have kind of progressive, leftist, often, kind of Marxist leanings. What sort of messages, like what is it that they kind of need to hear about Lebanon that they might be getting sort of misinformation from, or that they might just not be hearing at all from kind of the Western corporate media? Like what sort of messages about kind of the uprisings in Lebanon would you generally like to sort of send?
I think we should have more and more trust with the concept and the conception of people. This is a people that has been, resisting since forever. This is a people that has been suffering throughout occupation. First of all, colonization, and then occupation, and then civil war, and then neoliberal policies. So we should trust our peoples more to be aware and to know really what is good for them, because they have been unable to rule themselves and to decide what and who their rulers should be. Because of all of these levels and layers and different several layers of oppression. So I think we should have this huge trust, because I cannot talk enough about how surprised we are, as much as this is kitsch and this is, cliche, we have become so infatuated with the amount of awareness that we have discovered with the peoples that we have been organizing and working with for years. And, again, as Lenin said, it's a moment where we just discovered that, yes, awareness has just hit, and people are talking about against privatization. They're talking about against oppression. They're talking about against the rich. They're saying that we want to, if we're not going to live, we're going to kill the rich. So this is the highest level of a discourse, of revolutionary discourse. So this is, I think, Lebanon currently is an amazing for us, Marxists and left leaning people, to think about how in praxis national liberation is linked and is organically connected to what we see as the struggle against imperialism, against occupation, against colonization everywhere in the world.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to leave it. And really, so much of that goes to the heart of why I've been doing so many segments, specifically talking about people's protests, people's uprisings, revolutions across the world, because it's, so much of my show has tended to revolve around geopolitics, which is usually just the power struggles of the states and the kind of classes that are already in power, in existence, whatever those kind of contradictions might be. And to actually talk about these people's uprisings has been real inspiring for sure.
One quick remark.
Yeah.
Hello. This is specifically one of the reasons why, as Marxists, we see geopolitical situation, because we talk about people, because we organize with the people, because it is the view and the viewpoint and the perception of the people that we are trying to talk about. So it's pretty much this kind of bias that we want to push forward in our discourse. And I hope that this is clear now, and that it becomes clearer for the, let's say, left-leaning journalists. So I'm thinking about is a non-stop call called the bigger forces in the region, and talk about much more about the interests of the people living in the region.
Absolutely. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up. We were joined for this segment by Jana Nakhal, who is an urban planner, independent researcher, and a member of the Central Committee of the Lebanese Communist Party. Thank you very much, Jana, for coming on the show today. That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates in Austin, Texas, and is also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.